hello again. So I just punched out a quick launch just a moment ago. It was just a sounding rocket to complete a medium sounding rocket contract I'd accepted that wouldn't be done by the time this my Juno Explorer is will be done. So let's see, warp to complete. So just about 40 days of construction. No, it's going to slow down because a tech is going to finish. There's just like the one science point. All right, so we're going to do our first Juno Explorer launch. I'm going to do it as a sounding rocket rather than trying to reach orbit because I did a little testing. It's marginally able to achieve orbit, but I'm going to try to get a little more money because I just have nothing. Like, that's 10 times as much as I started with, but say not enough to upgrade the VAB, which would let me build 2 rockets at a time. And to be able to like farm a little money and to do sounding rocket contract at the same time I advance would be very nice. So let's see, we were going to roll out this rocket. Oh, that's debris from my sounding rocket. Okay, so it's ready to go. So I'm just going to wait until daytime to do my launch. There we go. So I pretty much went with the fast Juno Explorer. It's exactly the same as what I showed constructed, just the nodes, it's just slightly differently placed around the top. So at the moment, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using the FASA Juno Explorer setup, just because there definitely seems to be a broken collider in the bin. Like that's what I call it, the bin, the 11 Baby Sergeant pack. I was also doing a little bit of quick wiki research to refresh my brain. It looks like this wasn't really carried out until, let's see, this multi-stage system. So this kind of bucket of solid rockets wasn't designed by it was designed by Wernher von Braun, or his team at least, in like 1956, and they didn't fly it until many years after that. Like the first Explorers were a year or two after 1956, and I'm currently in 52, so you can kind of see where you'll get a divergence between history and this, because once you unload a tech node, even with TestFlight, TestFlight makes it so your parts can certainly fail. They're just let's see. I'm going to do it as a sounding rocket, so pretty much straight up. Okay, so ignite. Oh, did it fail to ignite? Very stable. Or did I fail to hit spacebar? Looks like maybe I failed to hit spacebar. Nope. No, it failed to ignite, it looks like. Ignition's remaining very stable. Well, that's a pretty lame failure. And it's weird. Some failures don't show up in TestFlight the way you'd expect them to. Because I'm pretty sure that's a failure type that can happen in TestFlight. Oh, speaking of which, I made a change so that show failure, one of these, enable the HUD. Yeah. So I made a change between reboots so that hopefully that will stay open now, between flights. But here, let me do a revert and see if maybe I borked TestFlight somehow. I wasn't getting that thing, and Agathorn pointed out I might just be lacking a settings file that's no longer included. TestFlight was kind of assuming that I still had that settings file. So maybe that's why the engine didn't ignite. I'm not sure, but I have seen failures, like when I'm working on my KOS flight computer, where you get a failure. It's very clearly a stage has not gone as planned, but it probably didn't stick through a revert. Okay, enable flight HUD, show failed parts only. Why not? Okay, so let's see if I can do a takeoff. And so lit, I should start to see thrust. Yep, there we go. That was probably just a TestFlight ignition failure. So if I was super honest with myself, I probably would have just considered that a loss, like scrapped the parts and built a new one. But, I do what's fun and kind of what works for the video series. So there you go. So I'm going to treat this as a sounding rocket. So rather than arcing all the way over, I'm going to go pretty much straight up with just a little bit of arc here. I'm going to let it lock into surface velocity. So yeah, this bin of 11 solids and the decoupler and such, something's wrong with the collider, probably for either this 11 decoupler part or the 11 solids themselves, which cause it to there's a bit of a jolt. It's very similar to if anybody's complained or seen about the lunar module from the Saturn V in FASA, and how it kind of doesn't want to decouple very nicely from the base that it sits in. Same thing, there's just something kind of borked with the actual model of the part itself that Kerbal KSP at 1.0.5 0.4 was okay with, but at 0.5 and beyond, it won't be okay with the collider which is part of the model, being that way. It's the difference between concave and convex. But there's a really neat way to make this bucket of solids without, because you don't have to play with FASA. I just kind of like the historical, or the more historical looking models and things included. Just like I really like Raider Nick's parts, and he's making more and more US rockets and more US probes that I'd like to include. And I'll see if I can like squeeze one or two into my memory, just with KSP at its current version. And I play in Windows, just don't have the memory for it. So that's why you may see fewer Raider Nick parts in this than exist. Because I'd love to use them all, I just don't have the memory. Getting to this. So yeah, like I think I mentioned in the previous video, like 1952 is around when this rocket was actually first built, and then it took like 4, 5, 6 years in reality to get to the point of building an Explorer with it. And I'd like to be able to bridge that gap with TestFlight, because TestFlight, it doesn't want to make you waste all this time and energy doing the historical launches where it's like you look something up and they say, yep, they first built this and started doing test flights in, let's say, 1952 or 53, and they didn't have a success for 4 years. And obviously, as a game, game developer and mod developers, they don't want things to be boring. There we go. So I'm going to show you the steps of this. Okay, so first we drop that. So we just have the nose cone, and it does actually have built-in. So if I want to point it, like let's say I just want to point it down a little bit, I can totally do that. See, right now it's slowly rotating down, but that isn't in practice what I currently want to do, so I'm going to use Persistent Rotations SAS and Time Warp cheat just to kill that off. But you can also induce roll, which is what I'm going to use to spin things up when I actually try to launch the Explorer probe into orbit. So I'm just kind of showing the staging bits. I'll obviously be doing the same process when I try to launch the Explorer into an actual orbit rather than using it as a sounding rocket. But everything's going to be so tightly timed, and I'm going to be focused on the launch, that this lets you see kind of all the operations, spread out over 2 launches. You can kind of see everything. I can describe everything without rushing and talking at 5x speed. So, once this is spun up a bit, it's not super fast, but hey, it's enough to provide some spin stabilization. And then we're going to separate from the nose cone and then fire these 11 solids. And they're going to burn for a bit, and look at all the altitude we're getting out of that. And in part, that's why I record these. I mean, I'd love people watching the videos and learning, and communicating through comments and likes and such. But in part, this lets me go back and look at my missions like this, the things I noticed during it, and I can just things I didn't notice. So I can go back and look and figure out, okay, how much payload did I deliver to what, for what. So see, it's wobbling a little bit from that separation. And that's normally those 11, like this 3 solids would be fully embedded in those 11. And even with just a little bit of it sticking in like I kind of had to for the nodes, it still got that ugly wobble, which, if I didn't have as much spin stabilization as I have now, or I had it fully embedded, could just completely ruin your chances of getting into orbit. And finally, let's do the last stage. And I'm breaking new records. So I've obviously I set up a different sounding rocket, contract medium, because free money. And of course, right now I'm trying to complete new records. I'm trying to complete the high sounding rocket contract. Let's see if I can find that in here. So completed the 400. So it looks like I didn't quite make it there, unfortunately. I'd really, really like to have. I'm just a little bit short. And sometimes, if I'm just kind of trying to streamline through a career, I would just literally just cheat. I would just add a little bit of hyper-edit to get the extra altitude. But you know what? That's just not what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to fail that contract because I don't have enough time to construct another, because that's the reality of RP-0. You kind of have to take a look at what you can build, what you have already built, how far away. You have to pay attention to how many days you'll have on that contract and what it would cost you to build the rocket to complete that contract. And I'm, just to kind of drive that fact home, I'm not going to cheat everything. I'm going to be honest here, and I'm not going to complete that contract. But anyway, so with TestFlight. So TestFlight, it does allow parts to fail, which I really like, because I like to fly a couple of missions that are much more risky with new hardware before I really jumped like this. I did that sounding rocket test with the first stage, with the Redstone missile with the Redstone rocket, specifically to increase how reliable it was. Before I came up into using it for kind of a critical mission, sort of like this, but really when I try to get into orbit, I want to have good data. I want to have reliable Sergeant rockets. I want that Redstone to be reliable. So I do a couple of in-flight missions. They cost me some money. I kind of have to plan. So, I want to do something of value that's going to get me some cash from those missions. So I really like that mission planning process. But at the same time, really historically, what drives some of the dates of, you build the first Redstones in like 52, but you don't actually use it for Explorer until 58 or 59. Ends up, it's in part, there we go. In part, it's because you have to do a lot of testing of these. So some of those flights are just terrible failures. You launch a bunch of Redstones, you test a few Explorer packages, and you just have catastrophic failures. And that's not fun. Not for the average person, your user, and it's similarly for me. But TestFlight does have an option now where you can research parts. And I want to show that off possibly in this video, but it may not work. I'll have to do a little more tweaking to get that option working for me in TestFlight. But in practice, you'll open up and you'll research an engine. And so technically you could build it into a part, but it'll have low reliability, as you've been seeing. And you have the option to spend money, so money per day with a science team to gather data. Rather than you having to do the flights, then you gather the data through those teams, which take time and money. So you have to kind of save up the time, or save up the money, and know you're investing to improve an engine you plan to use in the future. And what I'd kind of like would be, so that it could fit the historical timelines a little closer, would be to have a TestFlight config where the data is set up such that you unlock the engine, you have the option to do actual live flights if you wanted to. It's probably really not recommended, and probably nobody would or should, but you'd have so little data that you could try to fly those rockets, but they're going to fail. And that's one way to get the data, but really the best bang for your buck shortly after you research a brand new engine is to set up a research team, and then plug a little bit of money or a lot of bit of money every day over time to improve the reliability of that hardware. Now let's just see what this looks like. I'm just kind of curious. So yeah, the sun is over there, and that's what it looks like. Not quite in orbit. It got very high. You can see, so the package I used had enough delta V, to get in orbit if I do it just right. And obviously the trajectory I used, arcing way high like this, you're putting the engine into vertical velocity rather into horizontal velocity, going sideways to get to make a circle or an orbit outside of the atmosphere around Earth. And so in practice, when I launch this to try to put an Explorer probe into Earth orbit, I want, when my first stage burns out, I want my AP to be above 150, because that's just outside of the atmosphere. And then my other stages are going to deliver the rest of the horizontal velocity to put me into an orbit. So that's what my game plan will be. But I really like the idea of TestFlight balancing to help kind of set up history like that, where you unlock the part, you have the option to kind of rush it into production, into usage if you choose to, or you can follow a historical path where you research it slowly over time before you start using it in your hardware. And let me know if you really think that's a dumb idea, or if you really like that idea. I feel like that would be another layer of immersion, because right now, even with RP-0, like on hard mode, kind of like how I have it now, or it's recommended you play, you can get way ahead of historical timelines. If you've had a little experience, or if you've just flubbed through a couple of careers like I have, you have some idea of what the strategy or tricks of RP-0 are, you can get way ahead of historical timelines. The frame rate is making it look like this is processing slowly around. Interesting. And yeah, I'm not getting any new science from this, unfortunately, because I'm not quite up high enough into space high, I think it would be called, where I could get more science. And this is going to come crashing down. But yeah, I'd like to use TestFlight that way, and that's why I'm gathering data on one specific Russian engine, the It's an upper stage. I think it delivers about 300 kilonewtons. It was used in the Millennia satellite delivery system, R7 rocket. Totally non sequitur of what we're doing here, but I want to kind of have a catalog of the historical reliability data of that engine as an example, so that in test flight we have the option to have it actually start with kind of the historic reliability behavior, so we can really have the option to have the user research it through kind of through the lab, like the Americans tend to do. So you just kind of spend 4 years spending a bit of money to increase its reliability, and you don't have to do those flights. Or the Soviet way of setting up quick, dirty, cheap missions. You hope they'll work, but many of them will fail. And I did that just recently in kind of a Soviet playthrough where I made it up to about the mid 60s, did first docking, first station, things like that. And it was pretty fun. And I just didn't use TestFlight's research process because it didn't exist at the time. And some engines were just way more reliable than I wanted them to be during their first flights, because the Soviets would, if you look, they would use a certain rocket and they launched it 5 times, had a success, 3 more times, then had a success. Just so many failures like that. But they still, in RP-0, because there are sounding rocket careers and other objectives I can make, all those test flights were still worth it, just because I designed my missions well. So I found it very fun. And I'd like that option to be for both the Russian hardware and the American hardware. So, but yeah, let me know what you think about that. So we use that as a pretty good sounding rocket. We got our medium altitude, not quite the high altitude, but now I know I can use this as a sounding rocket. I could probably achieve that altitude if I just pointed straight up and quickly staged everything. Because the faster you're moving when you burn another rocket engine, the faster you're going to end up getting to go with it. But yeah, so that was a flight of that as a sounding rocket. It was pretty neat. Got to quite a whole new height, and probably not going to bother with more. Yeah, probably not going to bother with more. Okay, this one's just too easy. Altitude above that. I would just have to make sure of the days. 90 days. Yeah, it takes me less than 90 days to build that rocket, I'm pretty sure. So there we go. And I'm going to fail this one, so I may as well tell it now that I'm going to fail it, because I can't construct another rocket in 23 days to complete that. So thankfully it was just a cash cost. So you can see what would it cost you to fail a rocket contract there. Yeah, so I'm just going to go back into the VAB. I'm going to build another Explorer, and so my next video will be trying to put that into orbit. So thanks for watching. Yeah, comment your opinions of how test flight should be set up, or how you like historical progression. Do you want the immersion of the timeline to match quite exactly, which we could potentially do with a kind of an alternate set of test flight configs where you start at very low data with new parts and new engines, or not? Do you like how it is now, where you can kind of get ahead of the historical timeline? You feel like you're better than history. Yeah, leave any comments or whatever. I'll have probably have some new parts to play with pretty shortly. Once we get the Explorer in orbit, we'll have many new parts and we'll have lots of new options. So thanks for watching. Hope to have another video up soon. Bye.